In this game, I think Wesley So creates perhaps the strongest pawn chain I have ever seen in my life. This is ridiculous. You can only dream of this kind of pawn structure. There's still a lot of play in this game, though, even with that structure. Let's jump right in. This is a blitz game, and his opponent in this game is Aram Hakobian, and Wesley So has white. It's 3 minutes on chess.com, so it's a casual blitz game, but this structure is something to behold. I think you're going to enjoy it. In this game, Wesley begins with knight to f3. In a previous game against this opponent, which I covered, he played a king's gambit, but here he goes a little more positional with knight f3, knight f6, d4, and g6. His opponent is either going to play the Grunfeld or King's Indian, most likely after that move, and after c4, bishop to g7, he plays the King's Indian defense. We know that the King's Indian is sharp, right? He's letting white build a big pawn center, and then he wants to attack it with all of his might. So Wesley goes ahead and builds that big pawn center with e4, castles, bishop e2, e5. And the main line here for white is just castle, and after knight c6, d5, knight e7, you have this Mar del Plata pawn chain where black wants to advance with f5 and attack on the king side. White wants to play c5 and attack on the queen side. What Wesley So does first is he plays bishop to e3. This is the Gligorich system. Basically, he wants to stay flexible. He doesn't want to castle yet. He doesn't want to move any central pawns. He just wants to see what black is going to do. Black plays knight b to d7, and on seeing that, Wesley So says, okay, boom, d5, and goes ahead and creates that very Mar del Plata structure that we were just talking about. So black's play will be on the king's side. Wesley So's will be on the queen's side. Knight to c5, attacking the pawn at e4, so that pawn has to be protected. Knight to d2. Not only does it protect that pawn, but it also helps the queen and bishop control the g4 square, so black can't start any shenanigans on that square. And now he's threatening to play b4, kicking this well-placed knight out of c5. So what Hakobian does is play a5. That keeps Wesley So from playing b4 and ejecting that knight. So he plays b3 instead to slowly begin that process of playing b4. If he plays a3, then black just plays a4. And that fixes this weakness at b3, and that knight is going to be there for a long time. So b3 begins that process. Knight f to d7, clearing the way for the f5 pawn break to attack on the king side. Castles, f5, f3 to support the pawn chain, and now f4. A very common theme in the King's Indian, and we see that division between the queen side and king side here. Black really wants to go after the king, bishop f2 and g5. And this g4 square is going to be the main pawn break for black. It's been shifted from f5 to g4 now, and this white king is always in trouble in these types of positions. a3 to continue playing b4 to kick the knight out of c5. The knight returns to f6, helping to control g4 and preparing the g4 push. b4 kicks the knight. The knight moves back. Another approach was to just take and trade rooks, and after knight a6, c5, and white is still better here, although this might have been a little bit better for black than in the game. Knight c to d7, and now c5. You go right ahead. There are basically two threats behind this move. He could take on d6 and create an isolated pawn and then bring the knight in and just attack that d6 pawn, or he could just go ahead and play c6 and gain space, and by attacking the knight, force an exchange of pawns and weaken the central light squares. Black plays h5. CD6 have been played in a previous game, and that's also good, but Wesley So plays a novelty at this point. He plays knight to c4. He's still piling up on the d6 square, and black has to do something about it, has to defend that pawn, so he plays the knight to e8 to protect that pawn. But now Wesley So has that second strategy, and as we talked about that pawn chain at the beginning, he's going to be creating c6, attacks b7, and attacks the knight, which forces the opening of lines. So pawn takes on c6, dc6. So this is a real strategic victory for white in the King's Indian. If he can get this exchange, not only does it clear the d5 square, so a knight might be able to land on it, it clears this a2, g8 diagonal, this light square diagonal, aiming right at the king, and white can often put that to really good use. Hakobian plays knight d to f6 to support the g4 push, but also to keep d5 under some control. b5, beginning to advance these pawns on the queen side, and bishop to e6. Again, black really needs to keep d5 under some control. And now Wesley So plays b6. He's just saying, I'm coming right through. And here, black could take on b6, but after knight b6, rook b8, knight c to d5, just look at this constellation of pieces and pawns on the queen side. Absolutely devastating. White is in complete control in that position. So the Grandmaster Jacobian makes the decision to go ahead and play g4, and that allows one of the most unique pawn structures in chess, b7. Now, this is a protected passed pawn, but it's a protected passed pawn on the 7th rank, a very rare achievement in chess and a real strategic advantage. You might call it a mega pawn right here at b7. Now, here's the thing. Wesley So has won the queenside battle, but in a King's Indian, White, in a Mar del Plata structure, White always wins the queenside battle. The 1700 playing a Grandmaster, the 1700 is going to win the queenside battle. The problem is they're going to get mated on the king side before it matters. And black still has a fairly formidable setup on the king side. So the game is not over, even though this pawn structure is devastating. Rook to b8, knight takes a5. So black's only chance is a violent attack on white's king. So g3, a very common pawn sacrifice in the King's Indian. It opens lines and also clears these dark squares to open up lines of attack for black. Bishop h6 could have been played here, immediately taking advantage of those open dark squares. Instead, he plays knight to h7, basically clearing the way for the queen, and could help support g4, and then the knight can come in later to g5. Bishop c4. Basically, Wesley says, I'm just going to keep the play in the middle, right? The best way to deal with a counterattack on the wings is for central play. So he just trades off that valuable light-squared bishop, which is black's really most important minor piece in the King's Indian. Bishop takes c4, knight takes c4, and now his winning process is very simple. Just advance the a-pawn, but he has to deal with this attack on the king side. h4 hits the bishop, bishop to e2, knight e to f6. This knight helps control d5. It can also come into h5 and aim at f4 or g3. a4, queen to e8, attacking the c6 pawn. Wesley plays a5. Another strong idea was queen to b3, taking advantage of this diagonal heading towards the king that we talked about earlier. The c6 pawn would be poisoned because if black takes, knight to e5 check. Reveals the check from the queen and attacks the queen on c6. So that was another possibility. a5, queen takes c6. Now, Wesley So's pawn chain is so strong, he says, you can have my knight for free. I don't even care. You can have that knight on c4. These pawns are just too overwhelming, black, to survive. Queen takes c4. The knight hops into d5, knight d5. Now queen takes d5, check. He's down a whole minor piece, and he's trading queens. You're not supposed to trade queens when you're down a minor piece, but these pawns are more powerful than a minor piece. So he's actually trading down into an endgame when he's down a whole piece. Amazing. Queen takes d5, ed5. Now e4 from black, he wants to open up this diagonal. He has opened up the diagonal, aiming at the rook at a1. The rook moves to a4. Pawn takes on f3. Rook takes f3. Now black can't take on f3 because after g takes, king f7, a7, and that's it. The game would be over. These pawns would just advance. So instead, he avoids the exchange of rooks, but then rook to b3. Look at these pawns, supported by the two rooks. Unbelievably powerful. Knight to f6, a7, he comes in, and then a check, king f2, rook b to e8, but then he just promotes to a queen, and there's no perpetual on white's king after rook 1 to e2, king f3, and that's it. This square, of course, is controlled by the rook at b3, and black resigned. And I wanted to share that really impressive game and that amazing pawn structure with you. Now, even after this great game from Wesley So, there is still some great chess you are missing out on. To fix that, believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to look at is this game right here, also from Wesley So. I think you're going to enjoy it.